25 years have passed after Mr. Yeltsin was elected president of Russia. What happened and what was done wrong for us to find ourselves in the position where we are? So I'm making an attempt to turn to our past and I'm doing this to try and present the alternative for the future. How could it happen that the perceived democratic revolution in 25 years, with the succession of the governments, led to an authoritarian regime, which in the past 3 years is becoming more and more totalitarian? I know the viewpoint of Mr. Gutkov. I do not agree with him entirely, but I think that one can say that the regime is moving towards totalitarianism. In many people from the intelligentsia often talk about the 1990s as a time of liberty and hope, totally disregarding the innermost ties between the 1990s and the first 15 years of this century. But let us not forget that it was Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin who elected Mr. Putin as his successor. What historical choice was made in 1993 and 1994, when there was some chance to deal away with the past dependency? When these chances to deal away with the Soviet past were the highest in Russia. This was the window of opportunity, and I think that our today's status is mainly predicated upon the choices made then. This path was not the only possible, and it was certainly not a result of some storm. And this was indeed a subject-based decision. I think at that time, in 1991-1993, the choice was made for the development of capitalism from above, by privatization and by the control. This was done through the support of the capitalism and the state capitalism, rather than making an option or a choice for small-sized and medium-sized businesses, that is, building of the middle class. Here we also see that the political choice was quite in line with this economic choice. So liberalization of the market and privatization of the state property. The political sphere was perceived by the reigning groups in Russia in 1990 as an instrumental sphere of management. And so the democratic transit or the democratic transformation was not even discussed. This was a general derivative of the market economy. As a result, in 1991, and 1993, the democratic project in Russia was reduced to, or reducible, was believed to be reducible to the market. And so no transformation of the system, no fundamental legal or systemic change was introduced to the Russian statehood. The Constitution of 1993 consolidated the power of the executive branch. Of the two pillars of the Soviet power, the CPSU, or the Communist Party, collapsed in 1990 and 1991. And the second pillar, the security forces, the previous security bodies of the Soviet Union, were preserved to serve as the instrument not just for the Soviet nomenclatura, which passed into the new era, but also on the basis of the instincts of the reformers themselves, who were not seeing and were not in a position to make a compromise. Let me quote several very important statements of that time. In October of 1991, Gennady Burbulis and the first deputy of the head of the presidential chief of staff said that we needed these bodies, the security bodies, to the horizontal structures were needed to do away with the Soviet past. Now we need the vertical of power. The main important executive vertical is to take down the presidential orders and to liquidate the opposition to the president in the regional administrations. And this was long ago, long time before Mr. Putin even surfaced on the political horizon. So the reason why I'm quoting these speeches is that we're seeing a very well entrenched tendency to strengthen the executive branch. Sergei Stakevich, the first deputy of Mossovet chairman, wrote in Независимая газета, "At all times, in all countries, the intensive reformers and the penchant for reform was only due to the reasonably authoritarian leaders. These reasonably authoritarian leaders were those who could take the country forward. So the idea of an authoritarian modernization was indeed becoming the pillar of the so-called liberal consciousness." In 1989, Andranik Migranyan wrote about elective preference for the authoritarian methods in the market economy, was indeed multiplied and became a commonplace for either the liberals or for the new so-called democratic establishment. This was indeed the transitology of the Russian reforms. Mr. Yeltsin, elected president of the Russian Federation in 1991, was an extremely convenient figure to embody such scenario of development. What alternative was there? And of course, when I speak about capitalism, I mean a modern society in its entire plethora of social, economic, and political relations. So apart from the cooperative development, could at that time be based on the humanitarian and science-related intelligentsia, the highly qualified workers, and all those who participated in the democratic upheaval of the 1980s and were interested in installing the democratic channels of controlling the government. Economically speaking, this path of development presupposed the support for those who, in the beginning of the 90s, were developing their small business. This was the commerce, small production and service, all these reluctant forms of business were at the same time the grassroots market economy. This is the path of development which was indeed implemented in Poland. 40% of today's Polish business, producing 70% of the GDP, and 40% of these, which provide for the GDP, founded in early 1990s, were made in the 1990s. In Poland, 1.8 workers worked for every enterprise. This middle class, the small owners, were those who entered the time of market reforms. The old socialist At the same time, we saw the grassroots capitalism in Poland and a number of other East European countries. The Polish society, in the words of Andrzej Richard, was, as they say, handmade, and it was related by thousands invisible threads with the small owners. This was indeed the small owner economy which led to the success of the Polish history of success of a democratic transit and market reforms. Let me also remind you that I'm well aware of the results of the 2015 elections in Poland. I'm also aware of what the party of Mr. Kaczynski provided for, and I know how these problems could be developed. However, this does not cancel as to how the grassroots capitalism was developing in Poland. In Russia, the choice was made in preference of the large-scale privatization and making the old Soviet big companies the basis for the oligarchic capitalism. So what we see here is the transformation of the actual large-scale privatization took the place for the building of the middle class. So the political weakness of the subject that I was talking about, of the intelligentsia, of the highly qualified workers, I think that those who were interested in the grassroots development of capitalism were curbed. And it was already clear at that time. When we see the retrospective analysis, we know that there was this single path that was offered. And I think that Poland, and there are some participants from the Ukraine, but this, to a certain extent, this happened also in the Ukraine. So Indeed, what we should say that when we talk about this political subject, that the political will of the democratic leaders was of paramount importance. Their willingness to create political institutions, to create the rule of law, or to install the rule of law in Russia was incompatible with the actual desire to foster the executive branch. Against the background of the economic crisis, this inevitably led to mass disillusionment in the democratic ideals. In this way, I believe that in the 1990s, Russia lacked the political will to create institutions which could be viewed by people en masse as the champions of their legitimate interests.
A huge portion of our population that bore the brunt of the economic crisis and economic reform per se. Those people lost jobs, lost savings, and so on. Those people never got, instead, any democratic channels as a result of the approach I've mentioned. They never received democratic channels where they could defend their interests, which, like it happened, for example, in Poland or, for example, in Brazil, where after the transformation of authoritarian regimes, those channels came into being. In other words, democracy exists if the democratic institutions, parties and elections are an effective way for the majority of population to express and defend their essential interests. In Russia, these political institutions never came into being. Moreover, nobody meant this had to happen. It never actually occurred to those who assumed the name of democratic reformers. As I was saying, politics was viewed by people in government as exclusively in administration, not participation. And this is the most important reason that explains why the Russian society renounced democratic institutions so easily. They were worth nothing, and they were compromised as a way to achieve power between different oligarchical groups. And there's disappointment, there's disillusionment about democratic institutions lay the foundation to this turn in the values that the Russian society focused in, and whose effects we are just experiencing right now, and something that was so vividly described in the pre-lunch sessions by speakers Gudkov and Makarkin. I would like to refer to a study that I heard in April at the conference in High School of Economics, research team led by Polishchuk, that says, I'm quoting, that on the eve of post-communist transformations, the ideas of freedom, market and democracy enjoyed considerable popularity in the Russian society. Public opinion surveys of the early 1990s reflected optimism among Russians about new economic and political regimens. It showed tolerance for diverse opinions, the value of freedom, the need to defend political rights and freedoms, freedom of association, cultural autonomy, equality before law, and so on, the need for competitive election and openness of government towards their societies. Moreover, that public opinion survey, again, I would like to refer to this study carried out by Polishchuk and Levada Center, may have data that is coinciding with that or maybe conflicting with that. But this is the research findings I would like to share with you. He says that in 1990s there was a lot of overlap in what people thought about market in New York and in Moscow. But the very first use of market transformation led to complete loss of trust into each other and in the state, disillusionment about freedom, and growing cynicism and spreading of values of survival. Moreover, this is my fourth point I wish to make. In Russia, not only democracy failed. Where Russia failed is free market too, whose altar was where they sacrificed such big sacrifices. I will say a commonplace thing, but it doesn't stop being true. In order for the market to function effectively, one needs to have a state as the system of public institutions and not as a system of private power. We need independent courts and guarantees of property rights. An entrepreneur should have somewhat a horizon to work in this market. This system hasn't come into being, which certainly has to do with this choice that was made in the 1990s. Because denouncing for the sake of the depth and the speed of democratic transformations, when the government said no to the slow transformation that would require continuance in political compromise in order to find consensus, this denouncement seriously influenced the private property. Privatization in Russia did not go hand in hand with the fledgling private property instrument, which would function the public rules that would be same for everybody, that would be guaranteed by the free and independent court. Moreover, the statute of the property owner does not depend on the efficacy of economic activity. No, moreover, it depends on how close he was to government. Please look at the rise and fall of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And this system of relations was reproducing something that was traditional for Russia, the unity of government and property. This is something that evolved under the influence of the previous era in development, but in my view it was not predetermined. To a great extent it was shaped by the strategy of privatization chosen in Russia in the 1990s. There was no alternative. No, instead deliberate choice by the ruling group that gave them property depending on whether they wanted to preserve the system of government, Yeltsin regime. Yeltsin regime was the only stand for the oligarchic system of the 1990s, even at a time in the mid-1990s where it seemed that economic interests of large property owners seemed to subjugate the political government. For them, the main objective was to ensure re-election of Yeltsin as president in 1996 at any cost. At any cost. To preserve this, something typical of Russia, based upon unity of property in government. This was the centerpiece of all the efforts by the reformers. For this reason, that disbanded the Supreme Soviet in October 1993. This is why in 1994 they started Chechen War, which became one of the main and most important factors for the degradation of the state and the society. And for this purpose, since 1996, the ruling groups have been refusing to adopt elections in the democratic sense of the word, as a certain game following the known rules within unknown results. And instead, they sort of get make-believe elections, where the result is well known in advance. This happened in 1996. This is where I want to object to Mr. Makarkin. I'm sorry he's not in the audience. I want to object to his assessment of the 1996 election. The election was cancelled not by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. They were cancelled by those who named themselves Democrats. It was back in 1996 where they carried out an operation which actually castrated the concept of election as a game with an unknown outcome. I suppose it's not hard to judge retrospectively, but even you accept all the evaluations, assessments of Communist Party that Makarkin mentioned, the very moment when government would fall into somebody else's hands, when one political force was accept power from the other, that was very crucial at the time. And this is actually what happened in Ukraine. When Kravchuk gave over power government to Kuchma, both of them, to put it mildly, were not worthy, but they were different political forces. In the whole history of Russia, it has never happened. We have never seen peaceful transition of government from one political force to another. I suppose that this was supposed to have created institutional limitations for the Communist Party. But let's go how reality came about in. You remember those arguments. Everybody can say, if the communists win the election, that we will no longer see in the election. Okay, but we didn't have them anymore. But it was not communists who won, for that matter. Another very important point I wish to raise here. Well, today, sad anniversary from the decree of 1400, simple, forceful decisions, solutions for sophisticated problems became something commonplace for the government. Later on, it just grew in intensity, which means that, amongst other things, in the 1990s, we didn't see qualitative, irreversible change in the structure and in the legal status of property in Russia, property ownership. The way that was chosen to create large property ownership, that is, by converting government into property with the protection of the state, or by coming to underboard deals with some of these representatives, turns out to be more important. The legitimacy of this property ownership in the eyes of the society has been and remains very low. Most of Russia's population, and considers it very justly, that major estate in Russia were a result of collusion or embezzlement of state-owned assets. As a result of such privatization, the most liquid merchandise became the administrative resource, and this is what facilitated further conversion of large property ownership in Russia. It means when in the mid-2000s it became controlled by those groups who finally privatized the Russian state and now control not only the executive as well as the most profitable economic resources too. If I would like to refer to a recently published book by Balint Madzer, Mafia Post-Communist State, where he researches these processes using the example of Hungary, but that example is not alone. He says that unlike the main difference of mafia post-communist regimes, where he thinks Russia, Hungary and Central Asian post-Soviet states, is that the system of property ownership they set in place. He says that concentration of national wealth in the hands of ruling clan happens at the same time as they come into government. These processes go hand in hand. They're not motivated ideologically. Their hallmark is concentration of government and ruling power and property ownership. Secondly, they seek to displace former business, economic and other elites, which we have seen in the 2000. Why does he call this government mafia-like, mafiosi? He says that, well, mafia, as he says, takes prisoner government entities and wants the state enforcement to serve them. As a result, the state begins to act like a criminal group, acting in the interests of the ruling clan. In such a state, there's no government without property ownership, and there's no property ownership without government. Madzer makes a clear dividing line between what went on in Hungary and in Poland, in this political and economic sense, that in Poland they're dealing about ideology and institutions, whereas what went on in Hungary since 2010, this is changing takeover of property. I highly recommend this book. My only objection to the author would be is that, in my view, we're dealing not with a state, be it Russia or our systems. We're dealing with, in fact, absence of the state as the system of public institutions. In lieu of the state, we have a patron-client relationship typical of privately owned sort of government. In this state, how shall I put it? Well, the fight with corruption, Madzer refers to, is fight and struggle of one strong patron-client vertical against other weaker verticals. These verticals include mass of people, including cello player Roldugin, including Colonel billion holder Zakharchenko. It turns plus and cutting out Levitan's woods to make it a personal dacha owned by Medvedev, and the court stands to protect and defend. Sechin won the case against the Vedomost, who published the data about his palace in the pine wood that belonged to Barvucha Sanatorium. It means that Sechin demanded that the remaining copies should be destroyed and all internet traces should be removed because he thought it infringes upon his privacy. So, as I said, fight with corruption in such regimes as Mother claims. This is removing competing pyramids by mafiosi patron-client states. This fight becomes more intense as resource base grows scarcer, and there are fewer things one could divide. Colonel Zakharchenko, or the clan rather, that stands behind them are no longer allowed to do this. Prime Minister Medvedev and Sechin may do it any longer, but I don't exclude, as the situation gets worse, it would be Medvedev who would become the next scapegoat, as Saltykov-Shchedrin put, the next one thrown off the rooftop. So the next point I wish to make is, as I go back to the story which I described in just outline before you. The most important modernization objective that the country faced in the 1990s, to separate the state from the society, to move away from something that was traditional from the country, that is state-centric model of development. That is where the government, the state, is the sole and most important vertical structure-forming factor that suppresses independent development of society and its horizontal structures. Well, in this perspective, 25 years since the first Russian president was elected were obviously lost. And in the last 17 years, regrettably, the situation has aggravated further. The state turned into a system of government that is controlled by a narrow group of private vested interest, and most of the society is economically, politically, and in a social and psychological manner depending on this pseudo-state. This is where I fully agree and subscribe to what Mr. Gudkov was saying in the morning. The country has come up with authoritarian, personalistic regime that has basically destroyed all democratic freedoms and turned election into imitation procedure to legitimize a non-replaceable government, a regime that intensifies reprisals and creates even further reprisal structures who certainly predetermine its survival, too much to my regret. The beginning of this path when Russia went back into its historical track, bitter as I find this situation was seen in 1991. Yeltsin's victory in 1991, 93, 96, in terms of going beyond the dependency on the trajectory of the prior development, trying to reach these turned out to be Pyrrhic victory. They would even further enhance domination of the state over the society, executive over legislative, and the judiciary would impose a rapid and very painful economic reform upon the society without democratic reforming the political system. So we should acknowledge that the democratic alternative in Russia of the time was shut down by those people who claimed or called themselves Democrats. And lastly, in brief, I'll risk to say the following, to answer what we call the curse, or at least try to find the answer to the curse question in Russia. What needs to be done, just in view of what I just mentioned? As we seek to draw lessons from history, the first thing, strange as it may seem, is that this experience dictates to us it's not dictates, it's the wrong word. Yeah, this experience clearly shows to us that one needn't be in a hurry. Mind you, in those 25 years, we seem to be short of time at all times. In the early 1990s, because regrettably I stuck to that viewpoint which I tried to express here, although certainly I was doing it in marginal publications, and it was never any popular, but whatever. It's funny to speak about this, but whatever. In the early 1990s, all the conversations that the parliamentary republic in a split society is far more effective in terms of democratic development rather than presidential republic was rejected on the basis that we have no time. We need a strong executive so that we carry out privatization, take away the property from the Communist Party. In the year 2000, we also needed to be in a hurry. We needed to fast elect Putin. I draw attention to the fact that the majority of his opponents at the time then supported him, so that we take away the government from oligarchs. In 2016, again, we're short of time. We have no short time to self-organization. We keep aspiring for the split in the elites, which will somehow lead us to a bright road to the economic bright future. Well, I suppose that this sort of call not to be in a hurry, because again, something very commonplace, but the end does not exist without its means. In the way how we get to this end, this is really formulated by what is known by this high-flown word institutions, system of public institutions which the society imposes to its state. I'm sure without the pressure from the society, no split between the elites and no turn for the brighter road will ever happen. And this pressure is inconceivable without self-organization, which, as I said, has been taking place in an ongoing manner. I've been observing it. I've repeatedly said so in the school. I see it as like bubbles, you know. It seems like, but we see a new bubble appearing in an unexpected place. Look, people fight against the building of the churches, given that orthodox xenophobic madness that has encompassed the country and has been going with dirty propaganda when the people have to choose between a church and polyclinic. I'm referring to the most recent story. They choose a polyclinic because people in Moscow, there are several cases when people want the parks to not to be cut down because they want to build a church close by. I don't want to go deep into it because I want to leave room for Q&A. And one more thing I wish to say. I'm critical of democratic parties. Yes, how can we transform their social self-organization of political activity remains an open question. For surely we see a gap here, and I do not know, have no answer to this question, what needs to be done here. The experience here is rather negative. Social self-organization at the level of society, yes, it does exist, but it somehow doesn't transform itself into the political sphere. Here, the criticism of democratic parties, including the Yabloko party and the one that we heard here in this room, really always makes me feel uncomfortable. Why? Because this criticism of external observers, it's very much like the demand, make it for us and make it beautiful, make it democratic, give us an alternative. Well, I personally I've never founded any democratic parties. I'm sorry about that. That's why I will have to take into consideration with things that exist. They are common people with their, shortcomings and whatever. If we want to have something done, it depends on us alone. And I think that people with insulted feeling of self-esteem, we will see more and more of them. And this is an open question. I agree that the economic crisis per se and the falling living standard per se alone will not lead to the worsening situation. People will continue to endure. They need initiative. However, I think that this economic crisis shows that this political system is economically unviable, non-viable. I will repeat what I've said. In order to see investment into economy, in order to see economic growth and means to redistribute for the state redistribution, we need guarantees of property ownership. We need independent courts, and given this political system, which again, as was mentioned today, has been suppressing all independent activities, be it society or business, an independent judiciary in this political system is just something that cannot exist. So all the conversation about political reform that all of a sudden should somehow incentivize this investment and judicial reform, all this talk is senseless without radical change of government and property ownership. And what was mentioned today, declining growth rate and stagnation since 2012, when growth of oil prices was still high, that shows and points out that we have exhausted the economic capacity of the system, and it depends on us alone. whether we shall see this crisis of the system will turn to the decline, to this collapse, as it happened in 1917 and 1991, or then in the late 20th century, in the late 1980s, early 1991, when the old system collapses and the new system seems to be re-erecting itself along the same lines, the same structure, because the society has been frightened by itself and seeks for a stronger hand and strong leader. And I suppose it depends on us whether we shall accumulate change, whether we will see these bubbles or islands I've been referring to, which will help and will enable this institutionalization, which will allow us finally to make this process leave this endless cycle of repetitions.